So I want to show you the policy dimensions of these cases. And this next chart shows you, and I hope you can you read this next chart shows you the policy topics here. And so, as you might expect, the size of the box indicates a larger proportion of the court's agenda. And again, this is over the entire period from 1970 to 2016. You can see that the field law, crime, and family issues is the largest box there, and it's got over 1,000 decisions. Next in line is banking, finance, and commerce with 379. Labor and employment and macroeconomics round out the top 4. Immigration comes in 5th with 130 decisions. And so this just visually gives you an idea of what the court's agenda looks like. And if I might just say one thing here, the software that I use to create this chart and all of the charts I'll be showing today is not the software that animates the website I showed you earlier where I told you could create your own charts. This software is called Tableau, and at least in the US, students are allowed to get a free subscription to it. For me to get the subscription for the Clark Center, it was $1,500. But there is an educational version that students may get for free. And I am not someone who loves statistics. Math has never been my best friend the way words were always my best friend. And so when I worked in Excel, I would have to send the Excel file to a grad student, have her create a chart. She would send it back to me. I would say, oh no, I don't quite like that. Can you do this or that? Email it back, and you see how inefficient this is and how frustrating for me. Tableau has changed my life because it's very user-friendly, and I assure you that if I can use it, you will master it. I am now scouring the web for data sets to play with. I spent hours on my flight yesterday that was delayed, and we were in the air for quite a long time. I didn't care. I was playing with data. And so again, if you are looking for independent studies, a thesis project, there are plenty of data sets out there from all sorts of government entities. It's a great time to be a social science researcher because so much information is online. And if you would look into getting a free subscription as a student, this could really be a game changer for you. And if you are wanting to show employers when you graduate what skills you have, I think having Tableau analytic skills would be a valuable asset to help you market yourself. But I digress, back to the court here. So this is that major topic code, those 20 codes that allow us to capture the content. Let's take a look at these main policy areas. What are the issue areas at a more fine grain level that are at play there? And so we'll start with banking, finance, and domestic commerce. These are the subtopics that fall within that category. And so you can see that copyrights and patents is the largest share of the decisions within that policy area, followed by bankruptcy, and then different types of regulation follow. So just to step back to my larger question about studying courts and policy making, if I want to know, and if I want to choose to study an area of the high courts, or an area of public policy in Australia where courts might play a role, this would tell me, why don't you take a look at copyrights and patents? It seems the court's quite active there. What role has it been playing? Has it reinforced the government's policies? Has it been an institution where insurgents can come in and shake up the law in this area? Is it a policy monopoly? What's going on here? So I can't answer those questions for you today, but the beauty of looking at data like this is that even if you're more of a qualitative scholar, this can be a launching pad for you to decide what areas you want to study. So we go to the next slide. This is the macroeconomics subtopic. And there are multiple subtopics here. There are not just 3 in the coding scheme, but you can see only 3 appear here. So the High Court of Australia is involved in a much narrower swath of issues that would fall within the broader understanding of macroeconomics. And then you can clearly see here that tax policy is where the court has largely been a major player. And so clearly, if you want to study courts and policymaking in Australia, you should probably have a look at tax policy and see what's going on there. The next one is labor and employment. And here too, you only see 4 subtopics represented. There are more subtopics than that within this major topic, but the court has a much narrower agenda on these issues. And you can see worker safety, employee relations, and unions, I couldn't quite figure out how to get the whole word up there, are 2 areas where the court has been quite active over time. And then this one, you may recall, was the accounts for the largest share of the court's agenda overall. And that makes sense. If I had been involved in creating this coding scheme, I wouldn't have done it this way. So I've tweaked it a little bit to make it work for courts. But what you can see here are civil disputes are the largest share of what the court does. And these are generally commercial disputes, disputes about contracts. Was there a contract? Was the contract broken? What's the remedy for the breach? And then you see general criminal, interpreting the criminal statutes. Family issues. In Australia, unlike the US, and I don't know what the case is in Mexico, family law, marriage in particular, is a federal policy area. The Constitution gives that to the federal government. And so you wouldn't see family issues taking up this much time on the US Supreme Court's agenda, but it does on the High Court of Australia's agenda. Court administration is kind of a dumping ground for a lot of procedural sorts of cases that aren't really very interesting from a policy content perspective. So this also gives you an idea of what's going on in this policy area, and it may be that looking at the civil disputes and the court's role in contract would be an important policy area. So what I've just done is said over that whole set of years, what's the court's agenda look like? We can also look at the court's agenda over time. How has it changed over time? And this first slide is hard to decipher. But in this slide, I left all 20 of the policy categories, the major topic policy categories, in there. And it's hard to make sense of, because there are, as that first slide would have showed with the policy content, there are quite a few areas where the court doesn't issue many decisions. Maybe it's issued 5 decisions in that whole period of decades. So what I did is on the next slide, removed all of the small areas. And here we can see over time how those 4 main policy areas, law and crime, banking, labor, macroeconomics, have played out over time. And this really is the lion's share of the court's agenda. Now, if you look, you can see that there are some issues that have fallen off of the court's agenda and some that have taken over more space on the court's agenda. And so what I want to do next is highlight a couple of issues where that's the case. So here's the tax agenda. Remember, macroeconomics was one of the big 4 policy areas, and within that, tax was the largest component of that. But here we see over time the court's role in tax policy has declined dramatically. If you're interested in policy, this is probably warrants further investigation. Why has this happened? Why has the court become less involved in tax policy? What changes have happened that are driving this trend? What are the consequences of this trend? These are questions I can't answer yet, but are certainly ones worth pursuing. A second area that's declined is agriculture policy. And here we're talking, whereas tax was a major driver of the court's agenda, here we're talking of one of those small issue areas. But even though it's a small component of the court's agenda, we see a dramatic change over time. And so again, we might ask, what are the factors driving this? Because agriculture is still an important part of the Australian economy. So what has happened in this policymaking world to cause this trend? So there are a couple of other areas that have declined a little bit, but not as dramatically as this. And this leads to the question, well, what's filling the breach? What's filling the gap created by the court paying less attention to these policy areas? And the big one is immigration. And Australia, as you may be aware, has taken a very hard line on people who arrive there by boat without a visa. And in some ways, you would see an imperfect correspondence between this trend line and a trend line showing the number of arrivals by boat. This has clearly been an area that's consumed a lot of the court's attention in a number of different ways, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you would like. But this clearly says, okay, immigration is playing a big role in the court's agenda, and that's interesting because in Australia, the High Court has generally decided not to interfere in the government's policies. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but it's generally given the government of the day wide latitude with respect to immigration. So you can ask, what's going on here? What sort of ways is the High Court affecting policy in this area? So the next thing I want to do is I want to just take a quick look at the judicial review agenda, because I began the talk by saying this is the agenda where scholars pay the most attention to what's going on. And so we might say, well, if you're just looking at this part of the court's agenda, what would you see from a policy perspective? So overall, you can see that judicial review comprises a pretty small proportion of what the court has done from 1970 to 2016. The total number of decisions during this period is 2,663. And so you can, I didn't put the percentages in there, but you can visually see, right? Yeah. Usually they tell you don't use pie charts in presentations unless they make a dramatic point like this one. And it shows you that the number of cases that involve judicial review is quite small. And so to come back to my initial point, if these are the only cases you pay attention to, you are missing a lot of what the court does, in particular where the court is just interpreting a statute. What does the statute mean? But can have important policy implications. So the next one looks at the policy areas, and what this bar chart shows you is the percentage of cases in that policy area that are judicial review decisions. And so you can see here that international affairs,